ready to be done with the steering column of this project. So we're going to finish it up today. I'm not going to spend too much time going over the angles today. I'm just going to go ahead and cut them. I'll take you through the process, and then we'll work on the steering wheel, which should be a little bit more interesting. All right, let's get on.
I explained yesterday how I used the miter saw to figure out the angles. After cutting the sides, I then cut the bottom at an angle on the table saw. I went over to our pocket screw machine and I made a few pocket screw holes in the bottom to attach it. Then I used our drill press. The drill press here is set up with a table. The table is going to make sure the hole is 5 degrees. After I had a 5-degree hole drilled, I then attached the piece of wood to the front of our car. Once I had the front support board attached, I figured out the angle of the hole on the back panel, marked it out, drilled the hole again on the drill press, and then installed our steering column onto the front board. I slipped it onto the back board and then secured this board down onto the bottom of the car. Once the steering column was in place, I noticed that the dowel was a little bit too long. So I went over to the bandsaw and carefully cut it to length on the bandsaw.
All right, I've got what might be considered our dashboard just kind of temporarily tacked in place here. And you can see we've got our steering column now, and we'll attach the rope from the eye bolts over to the column here in a minute, and we'll see if that works. But before we do that, I want to talk for a second about our steering wheel. So the plan was to take a piece of plywood and put it right here for our steering wheel, but we need to figure out a way to reinforce it. Let me show you what I'm thinking. If this is our steering wheel right here, you can see it's only going to get glued on to this axle around the plywood, which is not going to be a strong joint at all. So I think what we should do is go back to the lathes and turn a piece of wood to go in here that this can then attach onto. Also, that piece of wood will help keep this from sliding in and out because it's going to push against the dashboard and against the end of our axle here. So we'll hop on over to the lathes and we'll turn a piece to go on there, and then we'll cut out our steering wheel.
After preparing the spacer on the lathes, I then created a template for our steering wheel. I transferred this template over to a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and drilled a hole in the middle for the axle. I carefully cut out the steering wheel on the bandsaw and then tuned it up on the belt sander and also with the oscillating spindle sander. After sanding it, I went over to our table router and I lightly rounded over the sharp edges all around the outside of the steering wheel.
Okay, so we have our steering wheel and we have the spacer that I turned on the lathes. These are going to fit together like that. The steering wheel is going to get glued in like that. We'll do that in a second, but before we do that, I want to make sure that our steering mechanism in front works. So let's rig that up right now.
I used parachute cord for the rope of our steering mechanism because it's thin, lightweight, and very strong. I followed the diagram that we looked at earlier, wrapped the parachute cord around the large dowel, and then tied off the ends of the parachute cord on the eye bolts. To keep the rope from slipping on the large dowel, I drilled a few small holes and then nailed staples in over the top of the cord. This kept everything pinched down and allowed the front axle to move.
All right, guys, it's been a while. I got a joke for you. This is a good one. I know what you're thinking. Mr. Lehman, do we really need to hear another one of your cheesy jokes? And the answer is yes, this is a really good one. Trust me. Okay, what do you call it when a dinosaur crashes their car.
Tyrannosaurus Rex.
I like that one. I thought it was good. Okay, we're gonna glue everything together, and we're not just gonna use glue this time, we're also gonna use dowels because we're gonna be gluing into end grain in places, and we wanna make sure this is a super, super strong joint because we don't want the steering wheel to come off while we were driving. All right, let's give it a try.
As before, I roughed up the axle with a rasp. Then, I used a drill to drill a hole in the axle and pounded in a small dowel to keep everything in place. After this dowel was in, I applied glue to the end of the axle and glued the spacer in onto the end. When this was done, I drilled a few holes on top through the spacer and the axle and glued a few dowels in, just to make sure that it wouldn't come off. Once these dowels were in place, I then glued the steering wheel on, following the same process.
Now I'm gluing to end grain here, which is why I need to add the dowels because end grain is not a good surface to glue to. After a lot of hard work, our steering mechanism is finally complete. When we come back tomorrow, we'll start working on the body. See you then.